Hi, my name is Amy Bergquist. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights and a vice president of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And I'll be walking you through this training for our pro bono volunteers who are conducting country research relating to the death penalty. The agenda for this training is, first of all, to provide an overview of the project so you can see how your pro bono work fits into the larger picture. Then I'll provide an overview of the template that you'll be using to guide your research and writing. Then I'll provide an introduction to the UN human rights mechanisms, which might not be as familiar to you as the other pieces of the research you'll be doing, and we'll talk about next steps. So first, an overview of the project. The country research you're going to be doing is part of a bigger project for the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty to create a death penalty strategic assessment tool. That tool is going to help the World Coalition assess whether a particular country is, on the one hand, at risk of reinstating the death penalty, resuming executions, or moving in the wrong direction with respect to the death penalty in one way or another. Or on the other hand, whether a country is sort of low-hanging fruit, ripe for moving in a positive direction, reducing the scope of the death penalty, eliminating it from its penal code, or ratifying the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example. So what we want to do for the World Coalition is create this tool, and this tool is going to be based on empirical evidence of countries that have had such changes, whether good or bad, in the last 15 years. The assessment tool will be fed into by regional assessments, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Europe. So there will be subsections looking at whether there are certain regional influences with respect to the countries that we're looking at in those regions. But what you're going to be doing are the individual country assessments. Then they will feed into that regional and then the overall analysis. So keep that in mind as you're doing your work. What we're looking at is creating a tool to help the World Coalition decide where to focus its energy, whether to focus its energy to fight back against possible expansion of the death penalty, or whether to focus its energy on this is a country that can make another positive step, and if we focus our energy there, we can make that happen. So that's the larger picture of where your research fits in. You have or will soon have a template, and this document is 9 pages long, but about the first half of it is a template divided into different sections to guide your research. And then the second half of the document is useful links for helping you with the research that you do for your particular country of focus. There are 9 categories of research topics in the template, and you don't have to research these in any particular order. We just want to make sure that your final written product covers all of these categories. And for some of the countries you're focusing on, some of the categories aren't particularly relevant. If a country hasn't used the death penalty in decades, then there's not going to be a lot of domestic law relevant to the death penalty. But perhaps what they did in the last 15 years is ratified the main human rights treaty on abolishing the death penalty. And so that's going to be the real focus. There might not be a lot of domestic law focus. On the other hand, maybe your country resumed executions or added a new crime to the list of crimes that are eligible for the death penalty, in which case domestic law is going to be really important for your research. So keep that in mind as you're looking through the categories of research topics. Some may be more or less relevant for your particular country of focus. So you'll look at domestic law, you'll look at a timeline of the death penalty in practice in your country from 2005 to the present. Then you'll look at international laws that's relevant to your country and the death penalty. You'll look at international human rights mechanisms, and I'll go into more detail about that soon. You'll look at domestic politics. Oftentimes, politics are an important factor in shaping what direction a country is heading with respect to the death penalty. Look at other domestic factors that might be relevant, civil society influences like non-governmental organizations or other influencers. Then international influences, sometimes there are international factors that play a role. And then interviews. Ideally, each country team will conduct one, maybe more than one interview with an expert on the ground in the particular country, a person or organization that has a lot of familiarity with the status of the death penalty in the country over the last 15 years, and also with a view to what do the next 5 years or so look like in that particular country. At the end of the template, there's also a suggested format for how you might want to present your results. You're not, while these are the different categories of things you're going to research, you're not going to present them in that order 1 through 9. You're going to have sort of an overview, and then a big part of your research memo is going to be a chronology. So within that chronology might be changes to domestic law, might be ratification of a particular treaty. All of that you'll be presenting chronologically rather than thematically as these 9 topics suggest. And then of course, helpful links at the end of the template. Domestic law. So that's the first category in the research template, and it's important to know what's relevant here. So when you look at the domestic law, whether it's the penal code or the criminal code, the Constitution, criminal procedure code, you want to keep in mind what the international human rights standards are with respect to the death penalty. Does the country have a mandatory death penalty where there's no discretion on the part of the sentencing authority to impose the death penalty? So that's one of the questions you're asked to research. And this 1.4 that you see here on the screen, that's the part in the template that I'm referencing. Another international human rights standard says that if a country is going to use the death penalty, it must apply only to the most serious crimes. And that term most serious has been interpreted to mean only crimes wherein the person being sentenced to death themselves committed an intentional killing. So felony murder rule would be excluded, and things like drug offenses would be excluded. Sexual offenses where there's not an intentional killing would also be excluded. And you'll see a lot of countries do have very broad definitions of which crimes are eligible for the death penalty, sometimes very vague statutes as well. Another international human rights standard that's relevant has to do with juvenile offenders. International human rights standards say that no person should be sentenced to death for an offense they committed when they were under the age of 18. Fair trial rights are also relevant. You want to look at what trial rights a defendant has. Are they different in capital cases where there's a risk of being sentenced to death? And you want to look at how the law protects the rights of people accused of a crime: right to counsel, legal aid, the right to appeal, etc. Another thing related to that is ordinary crimes versus military crimes. Some countries have abolished the death penalty for ordinary crimes, but retain it for military related crimes or things like treason. So take a look at that context as well. Also relevant there is whether civilians can be tried in military tribunals. That also raises fair trial concerns in a lot of contexts. So those are some things that you'll be examining as you look at the laws, the domestic law of the country you're focusing on. Then we'll jump into UN human rights mechanisms. And before we do this, I want to say that one of the things that you're tasked with in doing your research and doing your analysis is looking at, first of all, what are the inflection points? What were the important changes, or what was the important change in the last 15 years? You might have one, you might have more than one. And then you're also going to be looking at what were the causes or contributing factors that led to that change. And then also, in addition to that, what were the signals? What were the indicators that might have clued us in with 2020 hindsight that would say, oh yeah, if we had known at the time, this would have been a good indicator that things were moving in this direction. So that's sort of the gist of what you're going to be doing with your research, figuring out what was the inflection point, or what were the inflection points, what were the causes or contributing factors for those inflection points, and then what were the indicators or signals that that change was going to happen. So now we'll jump in and talk about UN human rights mechanisms. This is sort of an overview diagram of the international human rights system. You have at the United Nations the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is kind of the administrative body overseeing all the different human rights activities at the UN. You have the Human Rights Council, which is a political body established in 2006. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. You have the treaty monitoring bodies that are groups of independent experts monitoring implementation of treaty obligations. And then you also have regional and other human rights bodies like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, International Criminal Court, European Court of Human Rights, etc. One body I want to talk about that's not specifically part of the UN's human rights mechanism, but is relevant for your research, is the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations General Assembly meets in New York, and it is, as the name suggests, General Assembly of all UN member states. And it makes sort of big picture decisions, adopts resolutions when it meets. The General Assembly has various committees. The third committee is the committee that's sort of the committee responsible for human rights related issues. The third committee technically is responsible for social, humanitarian, and cultural issues or activities. And so here you just see a screenshot of the third committee meeting in November of 2020. Why is this relevant here? Well, every other year in even numbered years, usually in November, the third committee adopts a resolution calling for a worldwide moratorium on executions. So this is a chance for the third committee presses forward with this resolution, and then once it passes through the third committee, it goes on to the United Nations General Assembly for a vote there. So you may say, well, what does that have to do with the research that you're doing? We're looking at the votes related to this moratorium, again, that happens every other year in even numbered years, typically in November, October, November, as potential indicators. They're certainly not going to cause a country to change its position on the death penalty, but it may be a signal of where the country is. And it gives us a snapshot every 2 years. So we may be able to see trends in a country's voting record with respect to the moratorium resolutions as we look at the last 15 years and how those votes happened. So this is going to be useful research for you to get at and put into your chronologies. So what are you going to be looking for? First of all would be just the vote in the General Assembly, and that's part of your template. You see the 4.1.1, that's the piece in your template where we ask you to find that information. There's also a chance for every country to vote in the third committee. Even though it's a committee, all the countries in the world are in the third committee. So there's a separate vote in the third committee. Sometimes, for some reason, the vote in the third committee is different from the vote in the General Assembly. So that's a different vote that you'll want to look at to see what those indicators are. In the third committee, there is usually, the last few years at least, there's been a proposed sovereignty amendment that is proposed and voted on and has been adopted the last few times around. This sovereignty amendment is seen as hostile to the overall resolution because it basically says that countries have the sovereign right to determine their own criminal penalties for things that happen within their borders. So Singapore is usually the lead sponsor of this sovereignty amendment, and Singapore, of course, will vote against the moratorium resolution. So Singapore continues to execute people, is a retentionist country with respect to the death penalty. But getting a feel for which countries sponsor this sovereignty amendment can show how strongly they are committed to the death penalty or to their position on the death penalty. And voting in favor of the sovereignty amendment or voting against it can also be an indicator of what a country's position is in a given year with respect to the death penalty. Other points that may be relevant are co-sponsorship of the resolution. If a country is not only voting in favor of the resolution, but is co-sponsoring it, that can be a sign that a country is taking a more progressive stance, a more positive stance toward abolition. Finally, there is typically in the year following the resolution, so this would be in odd numbered years, there's something called a note verbale of dissociation. And this note verbale of dissociation is sort of this formal letter saying that we don't think the General Assembly has any business voting on this resolution at all. So again, it's extremely hostile toward the moratorium resolution. Usually Egypt is a leader of the movement for this note verbale of dissociation. And so if a country has a history of signing on to that note verbale of dissociation, it can also give you a sense of, at that moment in time, what the country's position is with respect to the death penalty. So these different votes and co-sponsorships and sign-ons can give you a little bit of a snapshot about potential indicators of whether a country is moving in a particular direction with respect to the death penalty. So that's a little bit of background research you'll do that's relevant to the General Assembly. Next, we're going to talk about charter-based human rights mechanisms, and these are important because they derive their power from the United Nations Charter, so they apply to all members of the United Nations. So all of your countries will have relevant stuff to look at here. First is the United Nations Human Rights Council. I mentioned that before. It's a relatively new mechanism established in 2006. The council itself is made up of 47 member states, and they're elected by the General Assembly by secret ballot. and they have geographic representation, so they're not all from one region of the world. And the General Assembly is supposed to take into account the candidate states' contributions to the promotion and protection of human rights and their voluntary pledges and commitments. But you'll also see, as members of the Human Rights Council, some countries that have pretty horrible human rights records. So it's not as though being on the Human Rights Council means that a country is engaging in really positive practices necessarily for that. But why do we care about the membership of the Human Rights Council? Well, again, this can be a snapshot of information. Countries become candidates. They announce that they're running for the Human Rights Council. And so a country that is running for the Human Rights Council may care more about their international reputation and may be signaling to the world that they want to move in a positive direction with respect to human rights. And so the mere fact that they're a candidate for the Human Rights Council may influence a country to take some positive steps toward abolishing the death penalty. So we want to look at which years the country was a candidate for the Human Rights Council, and then which years they serve on the council as well. So that can be important information. It could be either an indicator or a contributing factor for positive changes with respect to the death penalty, or possibly negative changes as well. If they were a candidate and then they were not elected, maybe they, move in a negative direction afterwards. So that'll be for you to assess as you do your research. Another aspect of the Human Rights Council is something called the Universal Periodic Review. Every 5 years, every United Nations member state goes through the Universal Periodic Review process. This is a chance for the Human Rights Council to spend 3.5 hours focusing on human rights issues in a particular country. So this happens in this 3.5 hour session is called the interactive dialogue. And it's a diplomatic process. As I said before, the Human Rights Council is a political body. So it's diplomats making recommendations to diplomats from peer countries. So it's a state-driven process. So during that 3.5 hours, any government that wants to can take the floor, can make a statement, and oftentimes what they'll do, the key to those statements that they make are recommendations. And anytime they make a recommendation, that triggers an obligation on the part of the state that's being reviewed to respond, to say, yes, we'll do it, or to say, no, we won't. There's no obligation on the part of the state to do any of it, but a lot of countries feel very strongly about the reputation in front of the Human Rights Council and in front of the world. And so they like to be able to say yes to a lot of recommendations. And there's also sort of a credibility issue as well, because if they have accepted recommendations, then they have to come back 5 years later and show that they've implemented them. So that can also get them sort of on the hook and under some additional scrutiny if a country made promises in the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR mechanism, to move toward abolition of the death penalty. That may shove it in a positive direction in terms of honoring those commitments. So this can be also a useful thing to look at in terms of influencing factors and in terms of indicators for your research. So this gives you a sense of the cycle, and this is important because it's a 5-year cycle, and I would say the interactive dialogue will say that happens at year 0. Year -1 is preparation of the information for review. The government will submit its own report. Organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty submit their reports. And then we fast forward about 10 months later is the interactive dialogue. That's when those recommendations are made. The government arrives in Geneva and makes its own presentation. And then all of the recommendations are summarized in a long report called a report of the working group that includes summaries of what things were said more generally during that 3.5 hour session, and then a long list of all the recommendations. And then either at that time or several months later, the government that received the recommendations has to respond, has to say yes or no to each of those recommendations. So that happens several months later is the adoption of the report. The key documents then are the report of the working group with all the recommendations listed, and an addendum. And in the addendum, that's typically where the government responds to the recommendations to say, we will do this, we won't do this. And oftentimes they'll give some explanation as well. So that adoption of the report is useful. And then basically almost 4 years of the 5-year process is implementation of the recommendations. To the extent that a country has accepted recommendations, it has until the next review to implement them and to come back to Geneva to say, here's what we said we'd do, and now here's what we've done. So what are you going to look at? Key documents for you to look at, as I've mentioned before, the report of the working group. The report of the working group summarizes the entire 3.5-hour session of the interactive dialogue. So it includes summaries of what the state under review said, including about the death penalty if they decided to talk about it during that interactive dialogue. So you'll see in that document paragraph by paragraph summaries of what things the government said. You'll also see the recommendations, including any recommendations related to the death penalty. And one thing that you might not be aware of that is related to the death penalty, but you'll learn about in just a moment, is the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, often referred to as OP2 ICCPR. So there may be recommendations to ratify the second optional protocol, or recommendations to abolish the death penalty or expand access to legal counsel for people under threat of sentence of death, etc. So that's one important document. Another important document is the addendum, and that's the official government response to recommendations, all of the recommendations, but it will include a response to the death penalty recommendations. Then there's the adoption of the outcome, which is usually a brief session, maybe 25, 30 minutes. There's no written record of that adoption of the outcome. It's just a video to take a look at. And you may want to see there in that video to see whether the government representative said anything further about the death penalty there. And we want you to gather this information for all of the 3 UPR cycles that have happened. Every country on our list, or almost every country on our list, has been through all 3 cycles of the Universal Periodic Reviews. So take a look at all of those as snapshots in time to see what the government's position was, and to see whether there were any of the documents can provide you with information about influencing factors with respect to the death penalty and the inflection points you have identified. Other key documents. So another thing related to the Universal Periodic Review that you want to look at that can be an indicator is what that country does, not when it's being examined, but when it's participating in the examination of other countries. So when a country gets to take the floor, does that country make recommendations to other countries about the death penalty? And that might change over time. So you want to see that what your country has done as a recommending state. Have they ever made any recommendations about the death penalty to other countries? Countries typically don't like to sound hypocritical. So if they are still executing people and sentencing people to death, they're probably not going to tell other governments to stop doing that. But at the same time, if there hasn't been an execution in quite some time, or if a country has made steps toward abolition, the fact that they would speak out publicly and encourage other countries to do the same is a sign of the country's strong commitment to moving toward abolition. So we would look at that information as an important data point as we're doing our analysis. The UPR info database is a great way to in a great succinct way to identify all that information, to find all of the recommendations your country has made. And you can limit your search to death penalty recommendations, and it will show you the dates those recommendations were made. We have a video for you that shows you how to use that database, so don't worry if you're confused at the moment. Another important set of documents related to the Universal Periodic Review are documents related to the stakeholders who engage on death penalty issues. So organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, as I said, we get a chance to submit reports for the UPR. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that administrative body in Geneva, provides a summary of stakeholder information. And then if you click on footnote 3 to that summary, you'll get to a list of all of the different stakeholder reports that were submitted for a country's review. And those documents can be really useful because part of what you're going to do under the template is try to find organizations that are engaging on the issues related to the death penalty in that country. So tracking down those stakeholder reports can be a useful way to do that. And again, we have a video to help you navigate through those documents. Human rights treaties are another aspect that will be relevant to your analysis in the template. And the particular treaties we want you to take a look at are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including but not limited to the Second Optional Protocol on the death penalty, as I've mentioned. There's also the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So those are the human rights treaties we're asking you to take a look at. Some are more relevant than others to the death penalty, but you may see that children, well, why would that be there? As I mentioned before, international human rights standards say you should not be executing anyone or sentencing anyone to death for a crime they committed when they were under the age of 18. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child that oversees the Child Rights Convention may have something relevant to say for your particular country. The key documents for each of these treaties, there are key things to look at. First is, when was the treaty signed by the country? Next is, when was it ratified or acceded to? Those are two different ways that a country can officially adopt its obligations under the treaty. And then when a country ratifies a treaty, it may issue or submit reservations, understandings, or declarations, often referred to as RUDs, saying we ratify this treaty, but with this particular understanding that blah, 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 blah. And it might be something related to the death penalty. If you're seeing a reservation or a declaration that's not relevant to the death penalty, then you can just skip over it. But you want to take a look just to see if there's anything in there that might be relevant for the particular ratified treaty. The treaty-based mechanisms don't apply unless the country has ratified the treaty. So that'll be important for you to look at the status of each of those treaties with respect to your particular country. But if a country has ratified a treaty, then it's subject to the jurisdiction of these treaty-based mechanisms, and often referred to as committees. Each treaty monitoring body or committee is made up of independent experts who interpret the treaty. And what's important here, or particularly important, is the periodic reporting process. If a country has ratified a treaty, then it's also signing on to go before these independent experts on a periodic basis to say, here's what we've done to try to implement this treaty. And the experts will ask some questions and then issue a formal report to say, here's what we think you should be doing to better honor your obligations under the treaty. So that reporting process can also give us information. It can also be a chance for a country to sort of clean up its act. If it knows it's going to be reviewed by a particular treaty body, it may implement some changes before that review happens so that it can go to Geneva and brag. The same thing is true about the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. Sometimes we see countries that make some pretty significant changes in the months leading up to that interactive dialogue. So it might be that that's a motivating factor for eliminating the death penalty or eliminating the mandatory death penalty or other changes. They may be doing that so that they have some good news to report when they go to Geneva. So be on the lookout for that as you're doing your research. Key documents for the treaty body review process. There is a state party report. This is typically what I call the self-audit. The country audits itself, says, here's what we've done. Usually there's a lot of praise, but sometimes there's some useful information, some facts, hard, concrete facts. Take a look at that state party report to see if it has any relevant information about the death penalty. Then the committee will issue a list of issues asking for further information about a bunch of different issues under the treaty. And then the state party will respond to that list of issues, typically in writing, to provide that information or to dodge the question and provide other information. So take a look at that document as well. There's also a document or a series of documents called a summary of proceedings. And this is just summarizing what happened during the Q&A session, during the dialogue with the treaty body experts. Take a look at the summary of proceedings to see whether the state party representative made any comments about the death penalty, to sort of say what its position is. Did they say we have the political will to move forward with abolition? Did they say anything to give us some indication of the direction we were heading? Then another document you want to look at is the document called the Concluding Observations and Recommendations from the treaty body experts. What did they say as sort of their final assessment of the state party? Is there anything in there related to the death penalty? Then there's a new mechanism called a follow-up report, and the state party is usually asked to report within 1 year or within 2 years about a few targeted recommendations in the concluding observations. They're usually things that the experts have said, you should be able to do this in the next year. Like, there's this little change you need to make in your law. We expect that you will do this in the next year. Come back to us and tell us that you have. They're not going to be major things that would take many years to implement. They're things that seem to be open to sort of a quick fix. So there might be something in the follow-up report by the state party related to the death penalty. Another thing you'll want to take a look at as part of this treaty body review process is civil society reports. Again, reports by organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty or other coalition members. They're going to be submitting reports to the treaty body experts throughout this process, and those reports may also talk about the death penalty. So take a look at those as well. Another piece of UN human rights mechanisms you want to take a look at are these subsidiary bodies of the Human Rights Council called special procedures or special procedures mandate holders. These are independent experts. It's usually one person called a special rapporteur. It might be an independent expert or it might be a working group. And so the working groups are typically 5 people. But there are 12 that focus on particular countries. There are 44 that have thematic mandates. And they're sort of the experts on the particular topic in human rights and that topic as it applies to all countries in the world. So one of the things these independent experts can do is examine, monitor, and report on human rights issues. There's a way to bring a complaint to these experts. They also have the ability to make country visits if the country allows them to visit. They will go to the country, they will conduct lots of interviews and meetings, and then they will make a report after their visit is concluded. So that might have a lot of information as well. So what will you be looking for your research? You'll want to look to see whether there are any special procedures mandate holders who have submitted reports, made statements, or conducted country visits in your country, and did anything related to the death penalty come up? Also, you can look at these complaints, look at whether there are any individual communications or complaints that were submitted that touch on issues related to the death penalty. There's a database, and we have a training video for you to help navigate that database. Next steps. We've created, as I've referred to already, short how to find videos, how to find documents related to the Universal Periodic Review, how to find the video for the adoption of the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review, how to find treaty body documents, how to find special procedures documents, and how to find civil society organizations. Because you remember, one of the things you want to do is track down one or more organizations located in the country, a local organization that is active on death penalty related issues. And you're going to, after you've completed your other research, you're going to reach out and try to set up an interview with that organization to talk to the experts on the ground and see whether your initial conclusions are consistent with what their view is on the ground of why things have changed in the country and where things are headed in the country. So this is the last part of your work. We'll be interviewing civil society organizations that are working toward abolition of the death penalty. In your template, it's 9.1 to 9.4. Conduct these interviews after you've completed most of your research. We want you to have a sense already of what you see as the inflection point or the inflection points, what you see as at least your initial conclusions as to the contributing factors or causes, and what you see as potential indicators with 2020 hindsight about what could have tipped people off that the country was headed in that direction. We'll provide you with a sample questionnaire that we provided for our colleagues in the Philippines, giving you a list of suggested questions, and you should adapt the questions to fit the particular context in the country you're looking at. And when you're ready to conduct these interviews, you can reach out to me to do an email introduction if it's with a coalition member. If it's not with a coalition member, then you may need to be a bit more entrepreneurial. So you'll be digging through the sources, digging through those reports and trying to find contact information to reach out to those local organizations that are working on death penalty issues. We have a short training video for you that's best practices for human rights fact-finding interviews, how to go about doing these interviews, and you should take a look at that as well when you get to this stage in your research. So that's the end of our training presentation. You have my name and contact information up on the screen. Also, if you want to learn more about United Nations human rights advocacy, et cetera, you can visit our toolkit, Human Rights Tools for a Changing World. It's at theadvocatsforhumanrights.org/change. Chapter 9 is our chapter about advocacy at the United Nations. So I hope that this training was useful to you. There's a lot of other research you'll be doing under the template. template that I don't think you'll need my guidance for researching. So just as an example, you'll be researching a timeline of the death penalty in practice. So you'll need to look at the number of executions the country has had every year, when the last execution was, how many people are on death row, et cetera. That sort of thing. I don't think you need my guidance, but I have put some helpful links at the end of the template to help you track that information down. You'll also be doing research on domestic politics, when there's been change in government, change in leadership, any public statements by the head of state or other political leaders about the death penalty, and other domestic factors like domestic initiatives to step up ratification of human rights treaties, any terrorist attacks that those might prompt a country to move in a negative direction with respect to the death penalty. There are all sorts of other factors that you'll take a look at and see whether they're relevant for your particular country and context. So I hope that that's useful to you in getting started with your template and your research. You'll also see on page 5 of the template, I have a suggested format for presenting your research results. I encourage you to follow that format for presenting your results. And then, as I've mentioned before, you have helpful links on pages 6 through 9 of the template document to help guide your work. We are also providing you with an example write-up on the Philippines that our intern team put together so you can see what a near final product would look like. So you have some guidance about what a final work product would look like. So I hope this training was of use to you. Thank you so much for volunteering for this project. It's really going to be a great service to the Advocates for Human Rights and to the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. We're really excited about this and hope that you can see this bigger picture, that this is going to be a huge help to our efforts to eliminate the death penalty worldwide. So thank you very much for your assistance, and I look forward to hearing from you if you have any questions or need any additional assistance. Thanks so much.